What the hell is this thing? Some of you clearly already know, but the vast majority of people have no idea what this is. This was SNK's answer to the Game Boy. Now, for those of you completely in the dark, here's a quick explanation. Everybody born before the 2000s knows what a Game Boy is. Better yet, you lot have at least held one once in your lives. It was that huge of a handheld console. It single-handedly made portable gaming a viable real-world option. Game & Watch and other pocket electronic games existed far before, yes, but nothing, and I mean nothing, had the popularity of the Game Boy. Nowadays, the Game Boy is defunct, and since then, Nintendo has moved on to the DS family of consoles, and have settled on the hybrid style of consoles, starting with the Switch. So it's safe to say, when it comes to handhelds, Nintendo is king. But over the years, plenty of other companies tried their hand at dethroning it. Sega, Atari, even the king of home consoles tried with their PlayStation Portable series. And it failed. Sony came the closest, but they admitted defeat with the Vita. But there's another company that at least stood a chance, and that was SNK. One of the last, if not the last, arcade giant that still makes games to this day, in the arcade especially. They try to take on Nintendo, and they try to take them on at debatably their weakest, because the Game Boy Color, while a great system, definitely was not as great as the original Great Brick, or the one that, succeeded it, the GBA. So yeah, could SNK beat Nintendo at technically their weakest? Well, the criteria are innovation, control, software, performance and specs, and lasting appeal. I am reigniting a console war that nobody remembers, and I mean seriously, if you do, check that shit at the door, because let's just forget all the, nostalgia, and let's just go back to 1999, and just think about it. If you were at a game store, and you had the choice between a Neo Geo Pocket Color or a Game Boy Color, which one should you get? First up, innovation. Looking on the Nintendo side of things, even by 1998, when the Game Boy Color released, the Game Boy was definitely showing its age. I mean, it had come out all the way back in 1989. Yes, 9 years. That is damn impressive for a console's lifespan. But they needed to freshen things up. Yes, we have the Game Boy Pocket, and Japan had the Game Boy Light, but it was still the same old Great Brick. So, Nintendo unveiled the Game Boy Color, and people were hyped for the breath of fresh air. But according to Nintendo, the Game Boy Color was not a new generational advancement. No, instead it is considered by them to be another iteration of the classic. Playing devil's advocate here, I mean, yeah, from a distance, that's all it really was. It was a Game Boy that could just play games in color. And not just new games, we'll get to that, but all the old Game Boy games were actually playable in a myriad of custom color schemes. You were able to choose these on console startup by messing with the buttons. This was something people only thought possible on the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, but here it was. So, was that really it? Well, with a little more optimism in my step, it actually was a bit of a more advanced system. Not only was it backwards compatible with every Game Boy game released up to this point, but it had its own library of games, exclusive titles that, while only slightly, did show an improvement in graphics, mainly having a much bigger color palette than normal Game Boy games. So while Nintendo tries to brush this off saying, oh, it's just the Game Boy, it's nothing special, it's nothing new, it very much was something new. It was, at least as a kid, this thing was great. I mean, it could play freaking new games, it had freaking color graphics. This thing was awesome to play with back in the day. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's focus on the main question, and that is, was the Game Boy Color innovative? God, no. As touched on before, Atari and Sega made their own handheld consoles years prior. And not only did those have color, they also had lit up screens. Were they primitive? Sure. But they released around the time that the original Game Boy came out. So the Game Boy Color was not innovative in the slightest. The original Game Boy already had the upgrades of the smaller form factor with the pocket version and the light. So why didn't they take those? They took the form factor, but why didn't they also take the light feature and put it into the Game Boy Color? So in the end, the Game Boy Color did end up feeling like a bit of a holdover until the more advanced GBA came out. So yeah, innovation-wise, there's nothing really here. But what about this thing? The Neo Geo Pocket Color. Very much like the Game Boy, it had a non-color version preceded. But within months of it releasing back in '98, SNK slapped color into it and released the Neo Geo Pocket Color in '99 to compete with Nintendo. And yeah, SNK did innovate a bit here. For starters, the Pocket Color had a menu UI, similar to some of the big boy consoles at the time, even including an awesome menu UI theme song. In the main menu, players could access a calendar, a world clock, an alarm, their horoscope, and a language setting with 2 options, English or Japanese. Seems pretty bare bones, but remember, this is 1999. Cell phones still only really made phone calls, and PDAs were still pretty expensive. So this is pretty innovative for a quote-unquote kids game system. But that wasn't all. Thanks to new emerging technology, each game now had the ability to save on the cart without the need of a normal battery backup, thanks to flash memory. Something Nintendo wouldn't adopt till the GBA. Oh, and remember that thing I said about changing language? Some games would reflect this change as well, making it possible to buy a Japanese version of a game and play it in full English. Both consoles are completely region-free, but Game Boy did not have dual language support. And well, that's it. Well, technically, there is one more thing, but I will save that for the next segment. All in all, the Neo Geo Pocket Color wins here. I mean, this thing is great. And there is one more thing that I haven't mentioned, but I'll, save that for the next segment. But yeah, there is one gripe I still have with this thing. Even though it was 1999, this thing still doesn't have a damn backlight. I mean, seriously. Atari Lynx, the Sega damn Game Gear, gave us light. And still, they were, I get it, it was cheap. It was a freaking cost measure, but come on, by this point in time, even crappy front lighting would have been just fine here. Regardless though, this thing is still impressive, and it is a damn cool system. Now, I will point out that even though this thing, wins innovation here, technically speaking, yes, while this thing did have signs of the future with, its cool menu UI, it technically wasn't the first in really anything. No, sadly the Tiger Gamecom had similar features. But you know what? That thing sucked. So I will happily allow history to think that the Neo Geo Pocket Color was the first handheld with these features. So yeah, between these two, SNK definitely wins this round. Next up, control. Nintendo is king when it comes to its buttons. Granted, the skinnier form factor did make it a bit cumbersome to hold as an adult. But once again, Nintendo perfected buttons. A and B were clicky with the right amount of spongy, and the D-pad, well, outside of the GameCube's D-pad, every Nintendo product has a superb D-pad. So no surprise there. But what about the Neo Geo Pocket Color? For starters, that much wider form factor is damn nice. It takes inspiration from the Game Gear and Atari Lynx with the buttons on the side and the screen in the middle. Only this is not a hulking mess and fits nicely in both hands. I mean, look at the original model for the GBA. It followed suit with this design. So yeah, this is preferred. So with that, the Neo Geo Pocket Color kind of comes ahead here because it's much more comfortable to hold. But again, Nintendo's buttons are legendary. So how could SNK top that? Well, I don't know what kind of drugs the R&D boys at SNK were smoking, but the idea of trying to recreate an arcade joystick on a small handheld was pitched. And they ran with it. One of the hands down best control sticks I ever felt on a handheld. Quite possibly on any game system ever. This is a micro switch joystick, and it feels pretty damn cool. Yes, this is basically an arcade stick shrunken down for your thumb. You would think this would just be okay, but it works incredibly well. For platformers, shooters, and even fighting games. I mean, I may be overblowing it, but legitimately, this was the single reason I wanted to own this actual handheld. And yeah, this is cool. This is just great in the freaking hand, and I just love the actual just feeling of it. It just feels great under your thumb. And it makes me wonder why the hell no one else has tried to replicate this thing. It is a perfect joystick for a little handheld. And oh yeah, the face buttons, they're great too. Right in between clicky and spongy. Overall, I gotta go with the Neo Geo Pocket Color. And that's not even including the second slimmer remodel, which sadly I've never actually held because I don't own one. But from what everyone says, it's exactly the same thing, just a little lighter. SNK wins here. I am just amazed how good this feels in my hands. Alright, now let's move on to the games. Because what good is a handheld if the games suck, right? Well, thankfully, that is not a problem with either system. Sound like a broken record here, Game Boy was #1. And it's pretty much because of the amazing library it had. Even upon release in 1999, the pack-in title was Tetris. One of the most addictive and celebrated games ever made. I mean, if you were into conspiracy theories, you could make the argument that the success of Tetris had something to do with ending the Cold War. Do I agree with that? Nah, but that's just trying to freaking put this all into perspective. That's how big Tetris was. And that was just one game on the system. But sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. We're talking about the Game Boy Color. What amazing games did it come out swinging with? Centipede, Game & Watch Gallery 2, Tetris DX, and Pocket Bomberman. You know what? That's not that bad. And to be honest, the Game Boy Color didn't have to come out swinging. Every Game Boy game was completely playable on it. And as far as libraries go, you not only have one of the biggest, but one of the best game libraries ever made. And not just for a handheld. Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, Pokemon, they were all represented here, and that means curtains for SNK, right? Yeah, pretty much, yeah. I mean, seriously, Game Boy wins here. There's not even a debate at all. But having said that, just because they got their asses handed to them, doesn't mean SNK didn't try and deliver some of the best games on a handheld, period. Puzzle Bobble, Sonic Pocket Adventure, Metal Slug First and Second Mission, Neo Turf Masters, and even hidden gems like Vasily. SNK made sure that even though they didn't have the quantity, they definitely had quality. Oh, and if you're a fighting game fan, thanks to the aforementioned control stick, fighting games for the first time felt great on a portable. Don't you dare try to tell me that playing Mortal Kombat on the GB felt good, because it definitely wasn't. Fatal Fury, SNK vs. Capcom, Samurai Shodown 2 on the other hand, well, these actually felt like you were taking an arcade fighting game on the go. Oh, and looking at the biggest game on the Game Boy itself, Pokemon, Neo Geo Pocket Color even had its own attempts at that, with Card Fighters taking on the Pokemon trading card game, and Biomotor Unitron taking on the classic RPG. So don't sleep on the Pocket Color, this thing is great. But again, Game Boy Color wins here. I mean, with a near 10-year-old back catalog of games, this thing already wins. And you know what? Let's exclude those. Let's just focus on the exclusive games for the Game Boy Color. This thing still wins. Pokemon Crystal, Zelda DX, Mario Golf, Wario Land, hell, even Metal Gear Solid was on this baby. Nintendo is unshakable when it comes to software. Easy win for GBC here. Alright, let's check under the hood. Next up, let's look at the performance and specs. On paper, they're nothing to write home about nowadays, but at the time, these were pretty decent. CPU and RAM wise, the Game Boy Color smoked the Neo Geo, with more RAM and a higher clock rate, as well as a bigger color palette. But on the other side, the Neo Geo Pocket Color had a bigger screen, slightly higher resolution, and more colors possible on screen. Oh, and let's not forget the sound department. And well, here's where it shows that on paper, things don't really mean squat. Sound-wise, the Neo Geo Pocket appears to be better with an extra sound wave thing. Alright, to be honest, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I mean, I think I do. But to be honest, I don't 100% know, so why lie? And you know, you're all going to catch me slipping in the comments anyway, so screw it. And to be honest, to my ear, the Game Boy Color does sound a lot better. But that could easily be chalked up to the fact that Nintendo has some of the best composers working for them. I mean, they're geniuses when it comes to music. So it doesn't really matter what you give them. Whatever they create, it's going to come out majestic. So yeah, on paper, doesn't really mean much. Oh, and I just said that the CPU and RAM of the GBC is better, but it's underclocked to like 2 megahertz, so numbers mean literally nothing if you aren't developing games for the system. The Neo Geo Pocket Color screen is almost 0.4 inches bigger and 8 pixels wider. Okay, but they're both still unlit and small for today's standards. So how the hell am I going to decide between these two? Well, let's look at how well they perform as a handheld. First up, the screen. Yes, as mentioned before, the Neo Geo Pocket Color has a bigger screen. But is it easier to see? The biggest problem with unlit color LCDs is that they're impossible to see without some kind of external light pointed at the screen. So which has the better viewing angles? Well, looking at the camera footage and my own eyes, yeah, the Neo Geo Pocket Color wins here. But ever so slightly, let's be honest. And no matter what game I throw into it, that's pretty much what the consensus is. I can see this screen far better. Now what about how the games run? With the Game Boy Color, it has shown its power by being able to run polygonal 3D games, albeit very poorly. Can the NGPC do that? It can, or at least it most certainly can fake it. But something it can't fake is frame rate. The Neo Geo Pocket Color has a 60Hz screen, but games were notably usually running at a lower frame rate. The Game Boy, on the other hand, ran at 60 frames per second. No matter what. And I mean the Game Boy. The Game Boy Color easily does this as well. And to be honest, for decades-old technology, that's incredible. So, performance-wise, I think that it's clear which one is the winner. Wait, there is one more thing I forgot to mention. And it's kind of important with handhelds, and that's battery life. So yeah, let's look at that chart again, and holy shit! 40 hours? Okay, I need to put this in perspective. The Game Gear and Atari Lynx could get maybe 3 to 5 hours on 4 and 6 AA batteries respectively. The original Game Boy could squeeze out 10 to 15 hours on 4 AAs, and the Game Boy Color could get you 10 hours on just 2 AAs. That's pretty good for the time. But the Neo Geo Pocket Color could stay alive for a staggering 40 hours. Even at half that, it would be incredible, but 40. If you still don't understand why that's a big deal, a huge reason why the original Game Boy beat the Game Gear and Lynx was because of battery life. More game time is something precious when rechargeable batteries were still a few years away. Look, I love that this thing can run at 60 FPS, but Jesus Christ. A better viewing screen and 40 hours of continuous play on one set of batteries. This wins. If I'm going on a trip, I would take this one over this one, hands down. Yes, on paper, this wins. But in real application and performance, this wins. No doubt about it. Now, we're finally onto the final category, lasting appeal. And here's where things get kind of interesting. Not just because of the tiebreaker, but because, sadly, SNK didn't actually get to have... Wait, what did the tally just say? Wait, what? The Neo Geo Pocket Color already won. How is that possible? Well, moving on to the final category, we can see why. Usually as I make these videos, I can rearrange the category so the final point is up in the air, and it can seem like a real competition is going down. But no, the Neo Geo Pocket Color wins. And it's not just because it's surprisingly an all-around better system, but because looking at the final criteria, there is no real victor here. At least, you know what, let's dive in. In lasting appeal, both are dead. Both consoles have come and gone for completely different reasons. Nintendo moved on to their new Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance, and it quickly became one of the best handhelds ever made. And since it was backwards compatible with every Game Boy game prior, well, that also meant Game Boy Color games. So, the GBC library lived on, happily, through there. But in the case of the Neo Geo Pocket Color, well, things didn't go so well for them. In the 90s, arcades were beginning to suffer, as players began to favor the home console market. SNK tried to break into this business with the expensive as hell AES, a far more reasonable yet still expensive Neo Geo CD, and then ultimately with the consumer-friendly Neo Geo Pocket. But it was too little too late. By 2001, the company went bankrupt and sold off all its game licenses, so looking back to the Neo Geo Pocket console, it itself was not a failure. The company failed before it even had a chance to really blossom. Thankfully, SNK has since risen from the grave, thanks to being active as a husk of its former self as SNK Playmore, through licensing old games and patchy slot machines from 2003 to 2016. This thankfully changed in 2016 when the company announced that they would again focus on making video games, and has since dropped the Playmore from their name. But so what? SNK is thankfully back. But what about the Neo Geo Pocket Color? Well, outside of the console modding and collector community keeping the little handheld alive, SNK surprised all of us by re-releasing Neo Geo Pocket Color games on Steam. And ultimately on the Nintendo Switch, one of the many successors of the Game Boy Color. On the other side, Nintendo has since re-released a handful of Game Boy Color games digitally to the 3DS. But with the eShop closing, the Neo Geo Pocket Color is the last one standing, at least officially, because not only is it available on Steam, the one digital store that I'm confident can outlive us all at this rate, but these games have been bundled and re-released on physical cartridge once again, allowing people to buy these somewhat with ease, instead of buying them online for ridiculous prices. Granted, at the time of this video, these are still relatively easy to get because not only are they cheap, but there's a bunch of new old stock still available. And yeah, at least these are far easier to get than this bastard. And this game in the front, this one's not that easy to get either, but still, well, say this is a lot easier to get than this. And there's way more of these copies. It's just sought after. The freaking collecting market's ridiculous. And you know what? Even if you didn't want to go this route, modern console-wise, yeah, it's still far easier to play Neo Geo Pocket Color games than it is play Game Boy Color games. So let's take a step back from all the info I just unloaded on you, and while I did say, or at least imply, that there's no clear winner in this category, that ain't right. So, who wins lasting appeal? Well, if you're watching this video and have access to Steam, you can start playing a Neo Geo Pocket Color game officially right now on your desktop. Don't have a computer? Well, chances are you have a Switch, and you can once again play it there with ease, with the added benefit of buying it physically if you want. You want to experience the original joystick for yourself? Well, while the NGPC can run you up to $100 at the time of this video, you can easily get yourself a decent library of games at an average of each game being $20 to $30. And I almost forgot to mention that thanks to the carts not needing a battery backup, you can expect these save files to last forever, unlike the GBC. So no matter what route you take, Neo Geo Pocket Color games are easily playable any way you spin it. And on the Game Boy Color side, every Game Boy except for the original and its variants, and the little Game Boy Micro, can play Game Boy Color games. But if you want an original Game Boy Color, they still go for pretty cheap. Average old carts go for also pretty cheap, but with a handful of games hitting prices over $50. And those are the ones most people are, trying to buy. So, as mentioned before, I would talk about the 3DS digital games, but even while at the time of this video, the store is still open for a few more months, by the time you're watching this, it's probably long gone. And unlike Sony, Nintendo won't buckle. They will happily kill off the eShop. They really don't care. And even if Nintendo makes Game Boy games available again in the future, I'm betting it's going to be like the N64 on Nintendo Switch Online. They will be behind a subscription because they seemingly have fallen in love with that business model. You know what? There is a winner here. The Neo Geo Pocket Color wins on lasting appeal because it is still widely available. I mean, I was trying to justify the fact that, I could play, Game Boy Color games on the GBA SP, or, I could... No. These are still hard to get. These are sought after. These are not cheap. And the fact that you threw away the only chance people could buy this thing with ease, even though the 3DS is actually getting expensive itself, the digital store is gone. The fact that I could play these not only cheaply on its original format, but cheaply on a Switch or a PC without emulating it. Yeah, I'm not even going to talk about emulation because emulation, obviously you can play this today, but in an official capacity, you can still buy these games. That is impressive. In this capacity, not so much. This is still hard to get. So yeah, for just ease alone, at least in an official capacity, Neo Geo Pocket Color wins because SNK, even though they died, they still came back and still care about their customers. Nintendo, stop doing this shit. People want to buy your games. People will keep buying your games over and over again. So, yeah, do better. The point goes to SNK because even after all these years, if you want to play some Dark Arms Beast Buster 1999, you easily can. SNK lost the battle, but they seem to have retroactively won the war. Well, that's the video. And yeah, it's weird to say that the Neo Geo Pocket Color wins here because it undoubtedly lost the actual console war. I mean, the Neo Geo Pocket Color only had 2% of the market share at the time it released, and that's insane that Nintendo had that much power. And it makes sense. Now, granted, I'm not saying that, if the Neo Geo Pocket Color had more time to flourish, it could have easily beaten. No. If Sony couldn't even dethrone them. And the PlayStation, Portable and the Vita were successful. But they couldn't even get a freaking, a hand close to freaking Nintendo. Nintendo was a juggernaut. They were non-stop the best, and they still are the best handheld makers out there, bar none. But all I'm trying to say is that they could have been a contender. SNK had the freaking gumption. They had the developers. They had the games. But god damn it, Nintendo just can't be beat in this freaking regard. They can be beat in the fact that, of being able to support their old games. Nintendo, you're dropping the ball there. But as far as old games go, Neo Geo Pocket Color, I recommend playing them. Especially because they're so easy to play now, and they're actually really cool just nice little games from the past, and yet they're still so much fun. That's the thing about arcade games. They're always fun just to play, whether just be putting a quarter in or just putting a cartridge into a freaking system. They're just so much fun to play. And SNK knew that better than anyone. So yeah, at the end of all this, all I'm trying to say is, play some Neo Geo games, whether it be from the pocket or the freaking classic arcade games. They're damn fun. But yeah, regardless, that's the video. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys later.